Good afternoon to everyone in Australia. Good evening, Prof. Gary. Tuned all the way from Michigan, and good morning to some of my peers here in Singapore and Malaysia. My name is June, just because I'm a guest host. Delighted to be your host today as part of this Australian Neonatal lecture series. Would like to thank Julie. Yeah, this is why we need Kurt. Yeah, for the opportunity to be part of this amazing webinar. It is my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Gary Weiner, who is a clinical professor of pediatrics at the University of Michigan and a medical director of Brandon NICU at Mott Children's Hospital. He serves as the chair of the Ilcor NLS Task Force, where he leads international experts in reviewing the latest evidence and that underpins our neonatal guidelines. He's also the AHA Resuscitation Guidelines Writing Committee and the editor of NRP textbook. If you have taught and attended an NRP course before, I'm sure you've seen Prof. Weiner before, quite literally, as a familiar face on the cover, especially the 8th edition, right? Yeah. So today, he will be sharing the latest Ilcor updates, highlighting the newest evidence, key recommendations, and what this means for clinicians. I will have what it means for us clinicians from all around the world here gathering, caring for newborn in the diverse healthcare settings. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Gary. Take it over, Gary.
Okay, thanks, Shinwi. Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and have the chance to speak with you today. And such a great, really large group and international. So again, as when you said, I'm Gary Weiner. I'm a neonatologist at the University of Michigan and the chair of the Ilcor Neonatal Task Force and textbook editor for the United States NRP textbook, which came out with its 9th edition just about a year ago. Let me see if I can get my slides to move ahead. Okay. I don't have any relevant disclosures for today, but I should let you know, of course, I am a compensated editor for the Academy of Pediatrics and American Heart Association and for co-branded Laerdal and RQI educational materials, but I don't receive any financial benefit from the sale of those materials. And I won't be discussing any unapproved use of a commercial product or device today. So as Dr. Kong mentioned, I'm coming to you today from Michigan, which is in the northern part of the United States. It's the state that looks like a mitten and it's surrounded by the Great Lakes. And because we're in the middle of the country, what many people here call the flyover states, few travelers from abroad ever visit us here in Michigan, but they are missing a lot because being surrounded by the Great Lakes, Michigan has 2,600 kilometers of continuous freshwater lakeshore. It is all salt-free and all shark-free. So that we see as a benefit. And then our lakes are also known for their sand dunes, and shown here is a part of the Sleeping Bear Dunes in the northern part of Michigan, which stands just about 140 meters tall. And it's a great experience to try to climb them and see if you can look across the lake all the way to Wisconsin. So, however, you didn't sign on today for a Michigan travel log, so I'll move along to the reason that when you invited me to speak today. And here are my brief learning objectives for our time together. I'd like to summarize what Ilcor is and how it may be relevant to you.
Sorry, Gary, I accidentally unmuted you. Yes, there you go. Oops, can you unmute? Gary? Do you mind unmuting yourself? There you go.
You good? Okay. All right, no worries. So these are my 3 objectives, and the last is I'll give you some of my personal advice to young resuscitationists. And as when you mentioned, I'm the chair of the Neonatal Task Force for Ilcor. Ilcor stands for the International Liaison Committee on Resuscitation. It was formed in 1992, but the Neonatal Task Force didn't begin until 2003. It took that long to convince Ilcor that neonates are different and need special guidelines. It is a collaboration of 8 principal resuscitation organizations worldwide. The 8-member councils include ANSCOR, the Resuscitation Council of Asia, the Indian Resuscitation Council Federation, the European Resuscitation Council, the Resuscitation Council of Southern Africa, the Inter-American Heart Foundation, representing South America, the American Heart Association, and the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada. In addition, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies is a collaborating organization. And Ilcor is organized into 6 different task forces, which include the Adult Advanced Life Support, the Adult Basic Life Support Task Force, the First Aid Task Force, the Education, Implementation, and Teamwork Task Force, a task force for pediatric life support, and then the Neonatal Life Support Task Force. And the mission of Ilcor is to promote, disseminate, and advocate international implementation of evidence-informed resuscitation first aid using transparent evaluation and consensus summary of scientific data. The Neonatal Life Support Task Force has 18 members. There's 6 emeritus members, 3 members of what's called the Scientific Advisory Committee that helps to guide our approach to systematic review, and 3 associate members. Associate members are oftentimes young career members who are learning the methods of the task force and may then progress to become task force members. And task force members of the Ilcor Life Support Task Force have a term that ranges from 2 to 5 years. And as you can see, based on the list on your right and the members, the leadership and emeritus members and our SAC Council, the task force really enjoys broad international representation, and there's an intentional effort to support geographic, resource, gender, and seniority diversity among Ilcor. And from the very beginning, key familiar names from Australia and New Zealand have made really important contributions as Ilcor task force members, including names you'll recognize like Peter Davis, Jennifer Dawson, Helen Liley, Lindsay Mildenhall, Chris McKinley, and others are on the path to becoming future leaders on the NLS task force, like Jazz Antoine. And call for applications to fill vacancies in Ilcor become available online every July, if there are vacancies to fill. In addition to the 18 task force members, the NLS task force is blessed with really valuable contributions from our invited content expert group. And we have currently approximately 50 members, and these key experts bring specific content and methodologic expertise to the task force's work. Some of the content expert group are former task force members who have rotated off the task force but remain key contributors. And others are promising early career members who become familiar with the NLS task force workflow. They have the opportunity to work with current members, and they form a really important pool of skilled systematic reviewers for future task force membership. And some of the names that you might recognize on the content expert group for the NLS task force include Stuart Hooper, Graham Polgase, Marta Theo, Richard Mosling, Maha Ali, Xuan Yi, and Bin Wei Kwek. Of course, all members of the task force and the content expert group are volunteers who dedicate hundreds of hours of time to the often really tedious work of screening thousands of studies, extracting data, completing complex risk of bias assessments, creating tables, crafting carefully worded language for systematic reviews, and attending online meetings that are typically at very unsociable hours, especially for those in Asia, Australia, and New Zealand, where the subtleties of individual words and exactly how they'll be translated into multiple languages are debated and debated and debated. Of course, most of this work is fit into the late night hours between their clinical responsibilities, their other responsibilities for their actual salary paying job, and time with their families. So when we meet in person, most fund their own travel. And so this is really it has to be a passion project, and to be a member of the task force, you know that you are committing many, many hours and giving up a lot of time. So what is the actual work product of the Ilcor task force? And our work focuses really on producing 2 structured approaches to studying existing research. The first is systematic reviews, and we also produce scoping reviews. And as you recall, systematic reviews answer a focused question that guides treatment recommendations. We start with a clinical research question using the familiar PICO format that stands for Population, Intervention, Comparison, and Outcome. The team will complete a comprehensive literature search guided by a research librarian and complete screening and duplicate using software like Covidence or Ryan. And then they'll extract data, summarize it narratively, or if it's appropriate, pool it using software like RevMan. Then they'll complete a risk of bias scoring system using tools like Cochrane Risk of Bias 2 for randomized trials or Robin's Eye. Then they'll rate the certainty evidence using the grade framework and create an evidence to decision table that transparently describes exactly how the task force came to their treatment recommendation. Finally, the team will draft what's called a consensus on science and treatment recommendation. We abbreviate that as a COSTAR. And this document will be posted online and open for public comment. And ultimately, most of our systematic reviews will also be published in peer-reviewed journals. The second major work product that the task force produces are called scoping reviews. And scoping reviews map a broad topic to describe the landscape of research knowledge. They oftentimes use a different format called the PCC format, which stands for population, concept, and context. They generally use a broader search and may also include things like gray literature. The final document that we produce will describe the type of evidence available. It'll clarify ideas, maybe identify key knowledge gaps, and hopefully it will ultimately help us to develop future PICO questions to develop treatment guidelines. Of course, when you see the long and detailed publications, read the statistics, see the forest plots that illustrate the results of meta-analyses, and the term consensus on science, you can imagine distinguished professors who have discovered absolute truths, and they just need to teach them to motivated students. And of course, this is really a fantasy. This is not how real clinical medicine works. We don't get perfectly clear answers from research studies. Oftentimes, the results from studies just bring more questions. We're often told by one study to turn left, and at the same time, another study tells us to turn right. And then someone publishes a meta-analysis, and the conclusion from the forest plot is we can't rule out benefit or harm from the intervention because the confidence intervals are too wide. Here's an example from our 2020 review on routine tracheal intubation and suction to prevent meconium aspiration syndrome among non-vigorous babies. And this forest plot shows the effect of routine intubation and suction on MEC aspiration syndrome in nearly 600 non-vigorous infants. Looking at the forest plot, 2 studies favored no suction. 1 study favored suction. 1 showed no difference, and the individual studies had confidence intervals that crossed the null. When you look at the pooled effect as shown by the black diamond in the middle of the forest plot at the bottom, it suggested no difference, but the confidence intervals include the possibility of both clinically relevant benefit and harm from routine tracheal suction. Of course, when scoring the certainty of evidence from these data, we'd be concerned because the total sample size is well below what's called the optimal information size. And this has a negative impact on the precision of the estimated treatment effect. In fact, of course, one of the biggest challenges in neonatal resuscitation science is that most of our studies are underpowered, making it really difficult to draw confident conclusions. To answer the question about suction and MEC aspiration syndrome among non-vigorous babies, a well-designed and adequately powered randomized trial is desperately needed, but it's logistically very difficult. To run the definitive randomized control trial, assuming a control rate of about 23% MEC aspiration syndrome in the non-vigorous babies, and 80% power to find a 25% relative risk reduction from suction, you would need to randomize and complete follow-up for 1,284 non-vigorous MEC-stained babies. To get that, you would need to consent about 12,840 babies with MEC-stained fluid because 90% are going to be vigorous. In the United States, you'd likely need to approach nearly 92,000 families for consent because about 14% of births are MEC-stained. So you can see performing the definitive trial is logistically just a nightmare. And the challenges are even more difficult when studying interventions that don't occur frequently. For example, consider our colleague George Schmolter's SURVIVE trial. This was a really important trial evaluating a potentially better way of providing chest compressions to newborn infants. Instead of our traditional 3-to-1 coordinated compressions ventilation ratio, George proposed giving continuous compressions superimposed by a sustained 20-second inflation. And the approach appeared really promising in laboratory animals and in a small pilot trial. So he designed, organized, and launched a clinical trial. The investigators powered the study to be able to find a 2-minute difference in time to return to spontaneous circulation. And even with this relatively large effect size, they calculated that they would need 218 subjects all total for about 109 per group. So given though that chest compressions are administered to only about 1 to 3 per thousand babies, they needed access to between 75,000 and 250,000 newborns. Now, consider how the investigators would get parental consent. Would they try to consent every mother before starting labor? Certainly, you can't try to consent a mother once the need for compressions is identified. So, unfortunately, the trial was terminated after 5 years, having only recruited 25 babies, about 10% of the required sample size. The investigators ran out of time, they ran out of funding, and they lost their insurance. Imagine instead if the investigators had chosen maybe even a more relevant outcome, survival to discharge as the primary outcome. If you use survival to discharge, the survival after DRCPR is about 64%. So if you consider a meaningful improvement in survival to be about 20% difference for like 77% survival, you'd need to enroll nearly twice as many subjects. So the data we have available are often not as definitive as those from resuscitation studies involving adults, where they can complete trials of thousands of subjects needing chest compressions or defibrillation. But as a doctor at the radiant warmer with a real baby, you have to do something. You can't say, I'll wait for more data, I'll wait for the next trial. The baby in front of you needs care, and you have to make a choice. And it's like the devil in this Larson cartoon telling you it's one or the other, but you feel kind of like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And when making treatment recommendations, we struggle on the task force with the same dilemma. Our treatment recommendations have to be scientifically valid. They have to reflect the certainty of evidence. But we also want them to be helpful to clinicians. And while the published documents may have the appearance of science fantasy with absolute truths revealed, this, of course, is how the recommendations are actually made. Every 2 to 4 weeks on Zoom and about every 6 months in a windowless hotel ballroom somewhere in the world, our task force and many of our content experts, including pictured here, see in the very back of the photo on the left side is Helen Lively and Marta Theo. We meet and spend hours talking about what the science means and what we should tell you to do. We try to tell you if you should turn left or if you should turn right. And like any international consensus, of course, it involves compromise and very carefully chosen words. Oftentimes, as we discuss the words that we're choosing, it's interesting because we'll find out that when you translate that into another language, some of the subtlety is lost. So we really do spend time thinking about how will our recommendation get translated into other languages. If you're interested in looking up the current Ilcor science consensus for any topic, they're available online at this URL, or you can follow the QR code that I've placed here. And when you get to the full listing of COSTAR documents, just search for neonatal life support under the categories. An annual summary of all of our new reviews is co-published every October in the journals Circulation, Pediatrics, and Resuscitation. And then a grand summary with the updated status of all of our reviews is published once every 5 years. Developing this grand summary is an incredible task, and it nearly killed Professor Lively in October. The most recent summary, which she led, was published in October 2025. In addition to the co-stars that are published online at ilcor.org, most Ilcor systematic reviews and scoping reviews are also published in peer-reviewed journals like Pediatrics, Resuscitation, or Resuscitation Plus. And if you go to the full online version of the co-star, this is what you're going to find. The details of how each PICO question was structured are presented, including the very specific outcomes considered and how the task force rated them for importance, as well as any necessary definitions. You'll find a really highly structured description of the task force conclusions of the treatment effect by outcome. The descriptions incorporate standardized language that we're trying to make more readable, using plain language rather than statistic speak. And we try to state clearly whether there's benefit to the intervention and the certainty of the evidence. The task force treatment recommendation is also included. The recommendation itself follows rules that are established by Ilcor that we have to follow, and includes words like recommend and suggest that express a subtle gradation in the strength of the recommendation. Each treatment recommendation is followed by a statement on the strength of the recommendation and the overall certainty of evidence for the intervention. Of course, at times, a treatment recommendation is described as a good practice statement. And these types of statements often describe interventions where it's either not practical or reasonable to obtain direct evidence from a randomized controlled trial. They oftentimes rely on a plethora of sort of consistent indirect evidence. And you can think of these recommendations similar to, use a parachute when jumping from an airplane. Finally, you're going to find a link to the evidence to decision table. And that's what the link will look like for you. And this document and the embedded table give you transparent details and insight into exactly how the task force used the available evidence and other important considerations to come to the final treatment recommendation. Many of the questions that we receive at the task force from readers of the COSTAR, frankly, are actually answered in this document. Of course, reviewing the science is just the first step in creating national or regional resuscitation guidelines and bringing them to the bedside. The participating resuscitation councils take the science reviews from Ilcor and write their respective guidelines. In the United States and Canada, a joint committee of the American Heart Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, and the Canadian Pediatric Society take the Ilcor COSTAR and write our neonatal resuscitation guidelines. And then the guidelines for North America are published in Circulation in Pediatrics. And then finally, the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Canadian Pediatric Society NRP Steering Committee and the textbook editors take the science and the guidelines and use them to write the NRP textbook and design the affiliated educational curriculum. The NRP textbook is currently in its 9th edition. The 9th edition was released last October, and I've had the incredible opportunity to be the editor for the last 3 editions. You can imagine, of course, simultaneously coming out with the Ilcor Consensus on Science, the national guidelines, and the educational materials is a long process that takes a lot of coordination to make sure that everything is consistent and in the textbook, all the photos are correct and the videos that go along with it. A similar process occurs in Europe, where the European Resuscitation Council takes the Ilcor COSTAR and creates the European guidelines. They use those guidelines to develop the NLS textbook, and that's now in its 6th edition, and the associated NLS course materials. You will find that there are some differences. So there are some subtle differences in the way the Ilcor Consensus on Science is interpreted for guidelines in Europe compared to the guidelines in North America, and there are some subtle differences between the NLS and NRP. Of course, a similar process occurs in Brazil and Japan, where the Ilcor science reviews are interpreted and implemented based on their local context. And I will admit, I am not an expert on the process in Australia and New Zealand, but I was able to phone a friend and got some help from Marta. And she explained to me that the guidelines are written and published online by NSCOR. The educational materials that implement the guidelines vary a bit depending on location. In New Zealand, the educational program is based on the ERC NLS program. In Australia, the most common educational program is NeoResus, which I understand was originally developed in Victoria around 2010. And some areas within Australia have developed and run their own educational programs. Here's a list of recent reviews completed by the NLS Task Force. We have recently completed reviews on video laryngoscopy versus traditional laryngoscopy, the ideal way to obtain emergency vascular access, whether it's UVC, intraosseous needle, or peripheral IV, the rate of rewarming for unintentional hypothermia, therapeutic hypothermia in resource-limited settings, respiratory function monitoring during neonatal resuscitation training, the oxygen concentration for initiating resuscitation in preterm infants, the use of cerebral NIRS during assisted ventilation, supraglottic airway devices during chest compressions as a scoping review, assisted ventilation strategies, considering things like rate, peak pressure, PEEP, eye time as a scoping review, and glucose management during or immediately after resuscitation also as a scoping review. And certainly from this list, one that will immediately draw attention is the review on oxygen concentration for resuscitation of preterm infants. We updated this review in the end of 2024 and published the updated treatment recommendation in the fall of 2025, just about 2 months before the publication of the Torpedo 3060 trial. Unfortunately, this is one where, despite our best efforts, we may have left you feeling that we didn't really tell you whether to turn left or to turn right. We may have left you feeling that you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. Here is the current treatment recommendation, and I do feel at times like we need to apologize a little bit for this, but we're being scientifically honest. Dissecting the details of the current state of science leading to this very non-committal recommendation would require an entire lecture, and I'm happy to return another time to do that. Our current recommendation from 2025 is among newborn infants less than 32 weeks gestation. It's reasonable to begin resuscitation with greater than or equal to 30% oxygen. This is a weak recommendation using low certainty evidence. For infants born at 32 to 34 and 6 weeks gestation, there's insufficient evidence to make a recommendation. And then we advise that whichever initial oxygen concentration was used, oxygen saturation monitoring and individualized adjustments of inspired oxygen concentration were used in most of the clinical trials and are likely to be needed to optimize outcomes. And then finally, the uncertainty over the optimal initial oxygen concentration means that it is reasonable to study a full range of oxygen concentrations, 21 to 100%, within a research protocol. In North America, we essentially adopted the Ilcor guideline for the American Heart Association guidelines and the NRP textbook, and understand that this may mean that across North America, different institutions start resuscitation of very preterm infants with a different oxygen concentration. At my own institution, we start with an FiO2 of 60%, but that is certainly not uniform throughout the United States. We have a number of reviews that are currently underway and will be published soon, including the use of a supraglottic device versus tracheal intubation, a review looking at assisted ventilation interfaces, thinking like face mask versus nasal interfaces. There's a review coming on chest compression depth and location, the accuracy of antenatal prediction rules for extremely preterm survival and neurodevelopmental impairment, face-to-face versus distance learning as a nodal review. A nodal review is when we team up with other task forces like the pediatric team. We have a review coming on neonatal versus pediatric resuscitation guidelines, umbilical cord management of vigorous term and late preterm infants, resuscitation of newborn infants with myelodysplasia as a scoping review, and a review on surfactant during resuscitation, again as a scoping review. And then we have a number of upcoming NLS task force reviews that are just about to get started. Included on this list is a plan to review the design and structure of current neonatal resuscitation flow diagram, focused on best design recommendations, taking into account human factors considerations. And in addition to the work creating systematic reviews and scoping reviews, the task force has other important projects, and one I'll point out is the publication of standardized reporting guidelines for clinical resuscitation research, termed the Utstein-style guidelines. And it's termed Utstein in recognition of the Utstein Abbey in Norway, where the first conference to develop this standardized reporting structure was held. And they've been available for many areas of resuscitation science for decades, but they didn't include neonatal resuscitation research. And by developing uniform reporting methods, the Utstein guidelines have made it easier to read, understand, and summarize clinical research. In 2023, a working group of the NLS task force developed and published the first neonatal Utstein guidelines. And ultimately, we hope that this will facilitate pooling data into meta-analyses and enhance both the clarity and the consistency of neonatal resuscitation guidelines. So if you are planning a randomized controlled trial, we certainly encourage you to look at the Utstein reporting guidelines and design the method of data collection and reporting following those guidelines. Okay, so with that, I'm going to close the door on the first two Ilcor focused objectives of today's talk, and I'm going to move on to take off my Ilcor hat. Hold on, let me pause for a second. Helen, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Gary, I just thought you might like to make a few comments about a question that Brett Manley asked, or a point he made in the chat.
I can't see the chat, so please go ahead.
Yeah, so in the chat, Brett commented, I hope, Brett, it's all right if I paraphrase your comment, but he commented that he really finds the terminology weak recommendation irksome, and said that if we weekly recommended that he goes to see the new Spider-Man movie, he wouldn't know what to do. And so I made the comment in return that with the terminology under core grade is actually changing to conditional or provisional recommendations. And I just wondered whether it might be worth asking you to expand on that a little.
So it's a great point. Yes, some of the language, again, the language that we use is standardized, and it can be certainly confusing when you compare the Ilcor co-stars with guidelines, because, and this becomes a real issue for us in North America, because the American Heart Association has its own standardized language that we're required to use. And so the task force at times struggles with language. Core grade is possibly the new, it's a little controversial, it is the new approach to looking at head-to-head comparisons of interventions. Core grade doesn't address things outside of interventions, and it doesn't address what happens if you have more than one intervention. Core grade is specifically for head-to-head comparisons of two interventions. It is, if you look at the grade papers, grade started out as a terrific idea from one of the McMaster work groups, and that helped to organize the way you evaluate papers. And it grew from a handful to, I think now there's well over 50 grade papers. And the core grade work group looked to find how can we simplify this down to 7 core papers that one of the focuses is using more plain language. And so we certainly are at this point using guidance from our scientific advisory council on how to, whether we should be incorporating core grade. And we've had a number of recent educational meetings and discussions with our SAC group. So it is certainly possible that in the near future, we'll be able to change the language of our recommendations a bit, but there will be times where we make a suggestion, and that's again where that the subtle gradation in language between saying we make a recommendation and we have a suggestion, and they can reflect the strength of recommendation. Go ahead, Helen.
I was just going to comment that ANSCOR uses essentially the grade language, and we will be changing to core grade language where the evidence has been assessed using grade methods. Of course, some of the evidence hasn't been. The other thing that I think is important about the conditional or provisional recommendations is that it's better designed to accommodate the fact that the application of a particular suggestion or recommendation may depend on circumstances quite appropriately. And there's quite a lot of our recommendations that we've made in the past that we have had to, because of the constraints of the terminology, we've had to call them weak recommendations because they may not apply to all the babies in a population, or they may not apply in all circumstances, such as, for example, with all resources, all team sizes, all the different considerations. And so I think the new core grade language will give us some flexibility, and for each recommendation that we make using that provisional or conditional terminology, there will be an expectation that it'll be followed by an explanation of what what we think the circumstances are.
Certainly. So if you make a conditional recommendation, you have to explain what the conditions are for that recommendation. Okay.
Thank you so much for the discussion. Yeah. We don't want to keep Gary till 9, right?
Sorry,
No worries.
I just thought it was a really important
Yes,
point
thank
that
you.
raised. And,
Very important, yeah.
All right. So with that, I am going to close the doors on the Ilcor focused part of the talk. And then I want to take my Ilcor hat off and spend the last part of my time with you before we hopefully get to time for questions. Focus on something to me that's actually much more personal. I've spent a lot of time recently thinking about what advice I would give the young, thin, dark-haired future neonatal resuscitationist on the far left if I could travel backwards in time 37 years to July 1989. And I've come up with 10 pieces of advice that I'd like to give him. And given the hour now, I don't have time to cover all 10 today, but I'm going to tease you with just 5 that I consider some of my top pieces of advice for a young resuscitationist. And this is, of course, my way to ensure that Julie and Junyi invite me back to give another talk in the future when I can cover all 10 in detail. So my first piece of advice is to use a carbon dioxide detector when providing ventilation with a face mask. It is the same device you use to confirm tracheal intubation, but used with your resuscitation mask. And here you see a disposable colorimetric CO2 detector placed between the face mask and the T-piece. If you are ventilating the lungs and exchanging gas, it will turn from purple to yellow. And we often say, Veni Venti Vici. I came, I ventilated, I conquered. And while we know that effective ventilation is the key to neonatal resuscitation, frankly, it's not always easy. We know that mask leak and airway obstruction are common. We know that the strategies used to assist term and preterm infants may need to be different. Depressed term infants often need to be resuscitated, but most preterm infants may just need to be stabilized to their new environment. When we apply a mask to their face, we may induce the trigeminal cardiac reflex and cause them to close their vocal cords and become apneic, limiting the effectiveness of our well-intentioned interventions. Unfortunately, others have shown that delivery room staff are not very good at identifying either leak, obstruction, or assessing chest movement. And this simple colorimetric CO2 detector can assist your team's decision-making. It provides visual feedback for the whole team at the bedside that can help you improve your ventilation technique. It's simple, small, requires no electricity. It only requires you to recognize a change in color, and it adds minimal dead space. As you proceed through your ventilation steps, if it changes color, the baby's heart
Recording in
imagine
progress.
how much better I can coach if I can see this view instead. I can confirm that what the trainee sees is the glottis, not the esophagus, and I can give helpful advice as they attempt to insert the tube. And if a coach had been using video laryngoscopy during this intubation, they could have prevented this esophageal intubation. Of course, in this case, I also would advise using a muscle relaxant. My advice number 3 is that every delivery room and NICU and transport team should have immediate access to laryngeal masks and know how to use them. These simple and inexpensive devices require minimal training, have a very high first attempt successful insertion rate, even in babies with craniofacial anomalies, and they can save a life if intubation isn't successful or not feasible. To me, it is the most inexpensive life insurance policy. In the United States, given low intubation success and decreased opportunities for pediatric resident training, the use of laryngeal masks is even more important. Unfortunately, we're struggling to increase use in the United States. Only 2/3 of USDRs report using them, and less than 20% of staff attending resuscitations report experience ever inserting one. And I should say only 2/3 of DRs report having access to them. We need to change the perception about LMAs. It is not the mask of shame. It is an effective method to secure the airway that may prevent the need for compressions and medications. Advice number 4 is to follow the simple rule. Anytime someone puts their thumbs on a baby's chest to give compressions, someone else immediately begins inserting an emergency UVC or IO needle while another team member prepares IV epinephrine. And this is because chest compressions alone are unlikely to help a baby that didn't respond to effective positive pressure ventilation through either an endotracheal tube or laryngeal mask. In animal models, coronary and cerebral perfusion pressure don't increase until epinephrine is given. When compressions are started, we know that delaying the first dose of epi decreases the likelihood of recovery. And in a large children's hospital with a sophisticated delivery room here in Michigan, actually, it took a median of 14 minutes or 10 minutes after chest compressions were started to get the UVC inserted. So everyone at the warmer should know when compressions start, we are inserting emergency vascular access. There is no reason to wait. And then my piece of advice number 5 is to simply ask, what are we missing? If the baby isn't recovering after the steps on the flow diagram, take a moment, review out loud what you know about the baby and what you've done, and ask your team, what are we missing? This allows your team to help you. It makes it safe for them to make suggestions. And a good leader makes it safe for their team to make suggestions. A good leader values what each person on the team brings. Of course, this can help you remember the other thing to think about when a baby isn't improving. And we teach that as the DOPE mnemonic in the NRP training program. And the DOPE mnemonic stands for a displaced tube, an obstructed tube, a pneumothorax or pericardial tamponade, and equipment failure. And the first thing on the list is to ensure the tube is still in place. So do you have a displaced tube? And of course, this is another great opportunity to use video laryngoscopy. Simply insert the video laryngoscope and ensure that you see this view and not that one. And of course, maybe use POCUS. If you have the skill and resources to identify a pneumothorax, or what's shown in this case, a cardiac tamponade, or you may be able to assess cardiac contractility, look for evidence of hypovolemia, and even assess your UVC position. This is, of course, an emerging area of resuscitation science, and we still probably have a ways to go in neonatology to develop how we're going to use POCUS as part of neonatal resuscitation. And so, my advice for a young resuscitationist, five key pieces here. If I can go back in time 37 years and speak to this young, thin, enthusiastic neonatologist, I would include these 5. Use a CO2 detector with face mask ventilation, use a video laryngoscope, have and use a laryngeal mask. Anytime someone puts their thumbs to chest, that means a UVC or an IO needle gets inserted. And when things aren't going well and the baby's not getting better, say to your team, what are we missing? And remember the DOPE mnemonic: displaced, obstructed, pneumothorax or pericardial effusion, and equipment failure. Okay, thank you very much for your time, your attention, and the kind invitation from Julie and Juinyi. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and see if you've got questions.
Thanks, Gary. That was amazing. Great talk. And love the 5 points. I've already jotted it down, considering myself still a young neonatologist. Okay.
You are.
I hope so. I hope to believe so. There were some comments. I just want to read it out in the chat group. Helen pointed that Ilcor is using the grade and will be changing to co-grade language as well. And thanks for the earlier discussion. Martha. Hey, Martha.
Hello.
From Melbourne. Hi. So she had a question. Do you want to just speak?
Yes, Gary, thank you. That was a very nice overview of everything. My question is about supraglottic airway devices and how to make it easy for nurses and midwives to be credentialed, because usually we never ask them to have ventilated a baby with a mask before asking them to ventilate a baby with a mask. But it's been a bit troublesome, at least in our area, to actually get that process easy for them, and particularly because the college has said to us that this is institution dependent in a way. And I was just curious to know how you've managed to do that in your area, and if you know about other places.
This has turned out for us to not be so much of a problem in the United States. For us, these things will vary a little bit by state, largely. So each state has a Nurse Practice Act that will delineate what nurses can do, and by the type of designation for registered nurses, their type of designation. Of course, institutions can have limits as well, but we have found in the United States that insertion of a laryngeal mask fits within the guidelines of the Nurse Practice Act in, as far as I know, every state in the United States. And we have very, very strongly encouraged institutions to not only avoid limiting unnecessarily limiting nurses from inserting laryngeal masks, but instead encourage them to. We've also been working with emergency medical services, because some of our EMTs are limited in what they can do, and laryngeal masks were not necessarily included in the practice guidelines for emergency medical technicians, but we've been actively encouraging that. And for us in the United States, the Academy of Pediatrics has been an advocate for that. And so we have found little trouble with that. And again, just locally in my state, in Michigan, the adoption of laryngeal masks has been slower than I would hope, but has really picked up over the last several years. And one of the benefits that I see is we no longer receive babies who have had 10, 12, 15 attempts at intubation and have a bloodied airway. We're instead called by a pediatrician who's in a rural hospital, and they have inserted a laryngeal mask. They've saved the baby's life. They call us, we fly and arrive, and the laryngeal mask is in place. The baby is resuscitated, and oftentimes we will fly back with our retrieval service with the laryngeal mask and go directly to the operating room if we need to for ear, nose, and throat to see the airway. So it's been a tremendous benefit for us. So I would encourage you to work as the equivalent of the Academy in Australia, New Zealand. Work with local governments and your health ministry to encourage that this is essentially a equivalent to face mask ventilation.
Yeah, because I have to say there's a lot of acceptance and very well received in training. It's only that we have repeatedly the same question, and we're trying to move away from saying that this needs to be a complicated process, but it's just where the validation needs to come from. So it's useful. Thank you.
One of the things we realized was that we were potentially getting in the way, because early on we included laryngeal masks in the textbook under advanced airways. And we have changed that to an alternative airway. And you'll see in the NRP textbook, we now include laryngeal mask in the basic in the ventilation chapter, chapter 4, rather than having it in the intubation chapter, so that we're trying to really encourage people. This is a basic device.
Agree, Gary. I think the wording for alternative really changed. We have LMA in our e-card, but it's never used. It gets expired, it gets replaced, and only when there's an airway code we take it out. So we should really try to get used to it. I think the recent trials of patent use for administration with LMA might also help clinicians get a bit more used to it.
That is certainly pushing things along here in the United States as well. We in my institution, we're a very active user of the SALSA approach, so surfactant through a laryngeal mask, and so I think our clinicians have a lot more experience with laryngeal masks now because of our use of SALSA. I do think the other thing is to move along. Hopefully people aren't using the old original device that you had to insert your finger and guide it. Use one of the devices that's either pre-shaped and slides in easier. So there are many newer devices that are just so much easier to insert.
Right. All right. There are more questions in the chat group. Madhu was asking if a laser projection of vertical measurements labeling ABC in a video laryngoscope improve pointing out the airway better. I guess identifying the anatomy. Is that what you mean? Would you like to speak and answer the question directly to Gary?
Yeah, Gary. Sometimes in extreme premature babies, hi. So it's difficult to visualize, vocal cords, especially if they are quite high. Or I thought something of that sort might be useful.
I have seen a couple of studies looking at the use of AI with video laryngoscopy to help guide the tube. It's an interesting question. Again, I think one of the things that's so clear about video laryngoscopy, it makes the teaching the anatomy much easier. So that if you have a trainee, if they watch an experienced laryngoscopist intubate for a couple of times, and they get to see the airway anatomy so clearly, and of course you can record using a video laryngoscope, and then you can go over it and again walk them through the anatomy, show them the arytenoids, show them the epiglottis, show them how the progression of geographic landmarks. Then when they have a chance to be their first attempt, the landmark and the anatomy issue is much less of a problem. It's still not an easy procedure. It still requires some real skill to guide the tube where you want it to go. So it doesn't, again, in the studies that we look at, it increases first attempt success if you use a video laryngoscope from approximately 40-ish%, maybe less if it's a inexperienced trainee, to the range of 60 to 70%. And if you use RSI, even higher. And so to me, it's a no-brainer. If you have the device, and if you don't have the device, advocate to get them.
Thank you. So we do have come across some smaller supraglottic airways known as AirQ with a 0.5 size. The eye gels have been used for more than 1.25. Any idea or experience of AirQ? What's the smallest baby we can go up to?
So again, I also I have used, and I hesitate to point to any company's device. One thing to point out is that there is no standardization in sizing. So the AirQ 0.5 is essentially the exact same size as the iGel 1.0. And so there's no difference. The AirQ 0 is slightly smaller than the iGel 1, but there's no standardization between sizes. And so just be cautious. There are some brands, and I've used multiple different ones, and I have my personal favorites and ones that I've had less success with. But we currently do salsa for babies that are 1,500 grams and above. But there are a number of studies that have described successful salsa down to 1,250 grams. And so there are a number of companies now that are coming out with more supraglottic devices that are aimed at preemies. So I think we'll have more opportunities to choose a device that we really like.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think to add on, the largest trial for salsa now used down to 1.25 and should be ending soon. I think I'm going to advertise for Callum. Another less than 20 patients to target global target.
Yay.
Right? Yay. Let's see if there's any other questions. Otherwise, can I ask the last question potentially? So Gary, for Ilcor, taking into all the evidence and trying to come up with the best scientific recommendation, but this is what the next Ilcor guidelines and the diverse health setting and resources. How could we tailor to the global audience? And we're talking about TPs, we're talking about video laryngo, but some places can't even afford a simple face mask.
Yes, it's a great question. I know it's one that at the task force we struggle with, and which is why again we will. Depending on the intervention that we're talking about, we may have specific reviews that are focused very much at the focused on limited resource settings. Other times we may make conditional recommendations. so that it will indicate if resources are available. When you look at the evidence to decision table, one of the areas in the evidence to decision table that we look at is it feasible to implement? Will it have an effect on equity and healthcare globally? And so these are topics that we think about, we struggle with. We have members of the task force that again can keep us or try to help us remain focused on the needs of limited resource settings. And we know, of course, that the greatest need for neonatal resuscitation and the greatest opportunity to improve the lives of newborns are in essentially, 8 nations.
Right.
There are essentially 8 nations. And then again, our opportunities maybe to collaborate with organizations like World Health and the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies may help us to disseminate meaningful resuscitation guidelines more broadly.
Yeah, sounds good. Maybe more collections from the lower resource countries, even for the trials, right? Because those evidence are generated mostly from the high countries. Yeah. One more question we take from here. Should laryngeal mask bagging completely replace, are we there yet? To replace face mask bagging, using LMA to replace?
It's interesting, certainly you look at, Nick Pejovic's study in Uganda suggested that midwives who were trained using Helping Babies Breathe and received essentially a 1-hour didactic and simulation-based training session with a laryngeal mask were highly successful inserting it, and it decreased the need for more advanced resuscitation. And in our review on face mask versus supraglottic device, we found that the evidence suggested that using a laryngeal mask or a supraglottic device instead of face mask may decrease the need for intubation or chest compressions. If you effectively ventilate, again, most babies, that is all you'll have to do. So if you're struggling with face mask ventilation, and it can be difficult, considering a supraglottic device can be considered as a primary airway device. I think many will feel that that's more invasive than maybe they want. But it is entirely reasonable to consider that device as your first airway device.
Thank you. Invasive, but compared to life-saving.
Yes. And moving on to endotracheal intubation or chest compressions is much more invasive, aggressive. So if you can prevent that.
Well, we have a really fruitful hour with you. It's quite late over in Michigan. I think we should let you go. Thank you so much again.
Thanks for the invitation.
On behalf of everyone. Yeah, we're okay. Well, I'm going to book you for part 2. All right.
Terrific. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. I'm going to share the next schedule for the next Australian Neonatal Lecture Series. Professor Martin Kessler will be speaking to us about what to do when your back is against a wall. Strategies for the babies with severe evolving BPD, another very, very interesting and practical topic. So stay tuned. See you in August 13. Bye, everyone. Good night, Gary.
Good night.
Bye, Helen. Bye, Martha.